All right. Sorry, Basha. Didn't get time to set up my mic, but I know you'll fix any loud or quiet noises. Well, it's good to see you guys. I don't know if there's enough notes for you guys. Dennis asked me to make a sermon on David, and I can't say my life was as impressive as some of the people covered before. I mean, Job is hard to follow up, Elijah, all these heroes, but I guess I was born. No, no, stand, cut. All right. There goes that sermon. But all kidding aside, I think we know which David the sermon is on. King David, one of the most well-known heroes in the Bible. Well, I think he goes in the competition at least. He's in the running there. What is he most known for? Anybody? Oh, sorry? No, all right. Bathsheba, yes, that is one of the things he is known for. His terrible sin. Actually, when I was planning the sermon, a lot of the sermons are just focusing on that point in his life. I think what we know him as kids is him killing Goliath. We're like, yeah, David killed Goliath. He killed this big dude. We're like, oh, that's impressive. But, there's a lot of things written on every single section of David's life. In fact, kind of last night, I was thinking I was going to have my sermon one way. I promised Stan this sermon, but then I was like, oh, man, I'm writing two different sermons. So I had to choose one area to focus on, and I'm going to have to choose the one where earlier in his life, when he is still young. I thought, well, this is a youth service after all. We are still somewhat young. David's still somewhat young, spiritually and physically. So we will talk about that portion of his life. I think, aside from Jesus, obviously, David is known as the best king, but he is not perfect. In fact, as I read through the books of Samuel and the beginning portion of Kings, I kind of saw a lot of tragedy and a lot of downfall in his life. And maybe we'll get to cover some of that today, who knows? Sit on this edge of your seats. But just to run down quickly, who is this David? The first half of his life. He begins as a shepherd. He is humble. He is like the eighth son, youngest out of his brothers. He gets assigned all the chores, and that's where we find him in the beginning, pasturing his father's sheep. Then Samuel secretly shows up. God sends him to anoint a new king, and he goes and oh, Jesse, where are your sons? And he's like, these are my sons. And he's like, God said, none of these are the ones I'm looking for. There must be more sons that you have. And he's like, well, there was this one guy, David. He's doing the chores nobody wants to do. And that's who gets anointed, the eighth son, the last one presented to Samuel. He then gets discovered for his music talent. I think that's not a surprise. If we've read the Psalms, we know that David has a lot of good stuff in there. We find a lot of comfort, I think, in the Psalms. And I'll actually get to reading some a little later on. He then, gets placed in the king's court, exactly where he's going to be ruling in a couple years, where God promised he'd rule, but as basically the musician there. He then faces the giant. I think we all know the story. He proves himself before God, the king, and the people of Israel. And so much so, he proves himself that we remember him to this day for that act. Then he increases in power. God leads him in clear obedience. In the work that he does for Saul is so great that Saul is like, all right, God wasn't kidding when he said he tore the kingdom from me and gave it to a better man. He sees who's on the horizon to take the throne, and he tries to kill him. That's an easy way to get rid of a problem, but God does not allow that, because that is not part of God's plan. He has to run away, and when he runs away, he loses his position of power, he loses his wife, one of them, he loses his wise counselor, Samuel, and he loses his best friend, Jonathan. So at this point of his life, he is at the lowest point yet. He is abandoned. He feels absolutely distraught. I think Psalm 34 or 37 is the one that describes him at the most lowest, and that's when he wrote that psalm. But this was all part of God's plan to put him into one of the most rigorous trainings ever for a king. And he's going to grow from this. He's going to have a lot of temptation and a lot of things to overcome, and he will. So first off, King Saul shows up in a random cave he's hiding in, and David's like, should I kill him? No, he's God's anointed. He respects the rank that God has placed Saul, and he doesn't raise his hand. Then it happens a second time, a little further on in his life. And if your biggest enemy, the person that wants you dead, appears in a cave twice without your awareness that you're there, and you have the opportunity to kill him, and you told God, no, God, I won't kill him because he's your anointed the first time. By the second time, you might be wondering, maybe God, put this guy here for a reason, at least that's what I would think. Like, that's where my mind goes. Like, are you sure, God, you don't want me to take this guy out? But it's another temptation for vengeance. But he overcomes it and says that vengeance is not his, it is God's. Another time in this kind of, David has spent some time, built up a little crowd of merry men around him. They go around doing some fighting, and he's protecting Nabal's flock. Nabal means fool, and we can see that when he tries to be stingy with some money and basically not pay David for his services. And David's like, I wasn't paid. Where's my money? I'm going to go kill the man, because that's how they did things back then, guys, all right? It's not crazy. He's not crazy, but he is mad, and he's got soldiers. So he's like, well, I'm going to get what's mine. And he almost falls into the temptation, but God sends a wise woman, Abigail, which diffuses the situation, says, are you sure you want to wet your hands with this fool's blood? And he's like, oh, probably don't want to do that. That would be bad for a king. And God saves him from spilling the blood of this man. And he kind of had success here. And in those temptations here, after he overcomes them, Saul says, David, you are a better man than I. You will be king. Abigail says, you're a better man than this. You will be king. Don't mess this up. So we have two affirmations of David's kingship by God. And Now we get to the seldom mentioned part where the sermon is mostly taking place. Chapters 27, 29, and the beginning of 30. I'm not going to read it all. You guys don't have to worry. But that is the period in his life. So we see David has experienced high points. He became the king's kind of most sought advisor. King wanted to kill him. Bad, low. He becomes this guy overcoming temptation. People are trusting him. He's gathering an army. And now we see another drop in his life. He overcame the temptation of killing Saul. He didn't twice. He didn't kill Nabal and handled it very well. He gave wisdom and counsel to his men. But here's what 1 Corinthians 10:12 says. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. So Scripture gives us, a warning that if we're, flying high, we're think we're avoiding everything, you got to be careful because the devil is going to hit you in those moments of pride, hit you when you think, I am spiritually strong. That's when the devil can come in and attack. And success is a very dangerous place for a Christian to be in. Many of the sins that David falls into happen when he's at a high point. Because this is kind of the first, I never did cheat sheets notes before. The first one is we tend to forget God's promises or lose faith in them when we have these high points or low points in our life. The devil knows when to strike. He knows how to take our advantages and turn them into sin, and he knows how to take our disadvantages and low points and turn them into sin. And kind of running down when David sins in his pride, when God granted him victory and he extended his kingdom over 10 times the size, he gets cocky and he counts the amount of men in his army, and then God has to be like, that wasn't you and your army that has won the victory. That was me, and he punished him severely with a plague. Another moment is in his sin with Bathsheba, like it was mentioned before. He has extended his kingdom. He is having a good time, living his life, and he decides to take a vacation from war. He's like, I got great dudes like Joab and everybody, Uriah fighting for me. I'll take a day off from war. And he's walking around the palace, sees a beautiful woman, he lusts, and in this act of boredom, in his pride as a king, he falls into this grievous sin. But back to the chapters at hand. The first verse in chapter 27, Samuel 1 says, Then David said in his heart, Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me that I should escape to the land of Philistines. And it's kind of crazy. He just the chapters before this describe all these victories and him not killing Saul and Saul admitting that, David, you're the better man. God is going to make you king. And, other people around him, like Abigail, saying, David, you're a better man. God is going to place you as king over Israel. And in all these promises, he forgets them. For even though he is reminded of them constantly, he ends up discouraged and falling into a temptation of discouragement. In here we see that he's making a claim about the future, even though the future is only in God's hands. And from the human perspective, we can never make certain claims about the future because the future is in God's hands, especially if he makes promises about the future. We know that they are certain. And we can see in these chapters, David never consults with God. Typically, when David makes a move, when we see he's spiritually strong, he'll call up a prophet. He'll say, what would the Lord want me to do here? We don't see that in these chapters. We see him purely making a human rationalization to go to flee to the Philistines. We don't talk about lukewarm Christians too much. I think we find it icky. We don't like it. We're like, do those even exist? Are they a myth? But I think that's because we don't want to admit how often we suffer with lukewarmness. I know a lot of us might be in a period of kind of the pit of despondency, what it's called in the Pilgrim's journey, kind of this period in our lives where we are not rejecting Christ, but we don't want to accept his calling. We don't want to pursue the things of Christ. And this is where David is. He was going strong, and he falls. And that often happens. We compromise with our desires, doubts, and temptations. And when we do that, we often don't stop once. We start excusing it and falling further and further into that pit. I think there are these situations that hit, and when we fall like this, we start to say, I'm hurting the service. If I stay in this kind of lukewarmness and I try to be in service, then I'm doing more harm than good. Or we think that we should suffer alone, kind of get our licks in away from the people in privacy, right? We'll go and seek sin in privacy, but that never works. We had a community series not too long ago. I hope you guys remember. And there we saw how we are connected first, to our family, to our friends. Then we're connected to our neighbors. We have things that we do that affect the neighborhood, that affect the city, and that grows into the state and even the country. And it all starts from individuals like us. So, when we try to live a lukewarm life, there are consequences for us and others as well. And we think we are these, separate beings, that we're disconnected, we're independent, but God didn't create us like that. So every action that we take, whether it be striving for the Lord or falling off into fleshly desires, that will have an effect on the people around us, especially people in the youth. We look at us sitting in our groups. You can just look around. These people are going to feel your actions first, and then the youth, and then the church, so on and so forth. Looking at Samuel chapter 27, 2-3. David arose and went over, he and 600 men who were with him. David is affecting these men and their families, to Achish, son of Moach, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Anom of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel. So these, we see clearly who is affected. We see David and his family. He's dragging his whole family with him, and he's dragging these people that see him as the leader. They have families, they have children. They are now coming with him to this Philistine kingdom. Gath is where the giant is from, where Goliath is from. Goliath of Gath. He is around there. They heard stories about him. And not everybody is going to accept him. But the king definitely loves to have another capable soldier. He accepts him, and David is able to lead his men into this dangerous place. On the surface, David's plan works. He avoided Saul's hunting him down and killing him, but he doesn't think about the dangers and the consequences that he is going to suffer from this. The land of the Philistines is not a good place to be. That is not a safe place for us to be. We as Christians could try to escape into the world and say, as long as I'm, messing around here for a bit, I won't affect anything. It won't have long-term consequences, and eventually I can return to serving God or continuing to worship after this time and enjoying my pleasures. But there is no such thing as a consequence-free vacation from God. First consequence. He stops serving the Lord, and he spends enough time serving Gath, the king of Gath, that he calls himself a servant of his. And he not only calls himself a servant of Achish, but he rules a city in his name, and he goes out and conquers in his name. Another consequence is David might have said, I'm going to go lose the heat from Saul and leave, but he ends up staying there for a year and 4 months. And what we know in this time, we don't know of a single psalm that can be attributed to David in his time in Gath. Because when you're out there ignoring God's calling for such a long time, your ministry, your work is going to suffer. You can't have a good spiritual life and also be in the middle of chasing your flesh and fleshly desires. So David obeys so well that Achish says, David's fully submitted to me in chapter 29, verse 3. He has fully deserted. He has abandoned his God and his people. And David, to uphold this kind of view of him, has to become this two-faced liar, because he also is a servant of God. He is a believer on the inside, but he is trying to have an unsustainable life with the Philistines. He goes out and fights the southern tribes that are not enemies of Philistine, but they're enemies of Israel. And when he has to come and churn and kind of make reports to the king, he says, I raided in the south of Judah. I raided in the south of this place. He has to be vague and to preserve his innocence. another thing that he has to do to preserve his innocence is found in verse 27:11. No man, woman, or child. And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. So he's going out there and he is slaughtering all these people to preserve his innocence. Of course, he is trying to make sure these aren't Israelites. He's making a compromise to preserve his time with the Philistines. But there comes a time where he can no longer lead this life. He gets called to war with the king of Gath. And when you gather a big war, you gather up all the kings. That's what the king does. He calls in David, calls in all the troops, and Philistines start questioning the king of Gath. They're like, "Are you sure this guy's true to us? Are you sure we can have him with us?" They don't trust him because David obviously killed a lot of Philistines before coming here, and that it doesn't build good relations. So he goes to this war, and it's people debate and can say, was David going to go fight the Israelites? But we see that typically, if you come with an army, you're not planning to get sent home. So it's very possible that David was about to have to make a choice and compromise and fight Israelites, God's chosen people. But God, intervenes and prevents David from fighting Israelites. He shows him and sends his whole world crashing down around him again. David now rejected the king's say, we don't want this guy, send him away. The king has to be like, break the news to him and say, sorry, David, we don't trust you. You have to leave. You're not quite a Philistine, but you're willing to kill Israelites, but you're neither. So David loses his identity. He's a man without a country. He has to go and run away again. So, that can definitely happen to us when we try to play both sides. We become neither Christians nor unbelievers. I think we know we can get called lukewarm. Leave it at that. But he goes back home and he loses his position again. So now he is a nobody again, basically. He loses the satisfaction of the sinful life he is living. He can no longer compromise. And this kind of leads him into depression. He comes home, he sees it destroyed. He sees everything that he's worked for amount to nothing. All the wealth he gathered fighting the tribes, all his wives are gone, and not only his, but everybody that followed him also have lost the people, their loved ones, their children, and they wept until there were no more tears. Now that's despair, crying until you can't cry anymore. That's the position David is in. Not only has he come to this despair, but now that the crying is over, people are getting mad. And he fears for his life again. because the people closest to him want to kill him now. They want to stone him because they're like, you led us here, David. We followed you. We trusted you. You brought us here into the land of the Philistines. And somebody has to pay for us losing our kids, all our everything we owned. And David is in a bad spot. I want to remind us, what was David fleeing from? He was fleeing from the danger of death by Saul's hands. Now he's in danger of being killed by his own men because of where he took him to. So in this kind of terrifying pit of loneliness and hopelessness, what is he going to do? This is his lowest point yet again, lower than being kicked out by Saul. He is worried now by his own doing, not by another man's doing, has his life come to ruin. So I think one thing that we can kind of look at and learn from David's example here is Christians can't afford cheat days. We can't afford cheat days in our meal plans. We can afford cheat days when going to the gym, but we can't afford cheat days when following our Christian walk, because all the other consequences, it becomes long period of avoiding God's call, and it ultimately leads to ruin. So here, David is worried, to say the least. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughter. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. So, what is David's only option in this situation? He is probably going to die, and here, finally, after 2.5 chapters, we finally see David call out to God. And in his ruin, chasing after fleshly desire, just safety, and he sees that there is no safety here. There is nothing that he can enjoy here. He has to fall back and cry out to God. So I do want to read a bit of the Psalms here. There it is. All right. Here's what David says about God. Psalm 139, first 12 verses. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thoughts from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down. You are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and light around me will be night. Even in the darkness, Even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. What is he saying here? God was not absent in David's little break away from his following his path. God did not forget about David. It was like, oh, that guy that I wanted to make king, oh, he went to the Philistines. He didn't forget there. He saw David making these choices that led him further away from God. And he ultimately did not let him perish. David, in this moment of worry, he strengthens himself in the Lord. He calls for ephod to be brought. So basically, he's making a call to God. Do you want me to, do this? Basically, asking for God's guidance, and God answers him, and David doesn't get stoned. A little portion here from Psalm 91. Because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him securely on high, because he has known my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him with a long life. I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation. So, because he loved me, that is past tense. Once loved, always loved. We see David for a period of time, a year and 4 months. I don't know what your guys' slumps or lukewarm periods have been, but a year and 4 months is a long time. And God doesn't abandon him to the results of his actions. He's not saying, you abandoned me, therefore I wipe my hands clean of you. He hears David's cry and comes to his salvation. I want us to be encouraged by that. I know a lot of us try to walk in the flesh and also want to be considered Christians. We show up to church, and I'm not talking about we. I'm talking about we, me, and those of us struggling. I know for sure I have these slumps. Last series, I didn't want to preach because I withdrew, just like David, into the flesh, but I cried out, and God rescued me, and I want us to remember that we can always come back to his throne, like Hebrews 4. Put a bookmark in here, I swear. There it is. Hebrews 4:14. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. What greater is the time of need than when we have walked and tried to deny God at every step? That is when we are in the greatest danger, when we try to play both sides in our lukewarm condition. So, as the worship team comes up here, I want us to remember God will not abandon us. We can say, take from this sermon, David was a great man. David was a man after God's own heart, and yet he has fallen. He has went on this slump. What chance do we have? And I can say that we will fall into pits of despondency. The problem is when we make that our home, when we make it the place where we stay and excuse it. We have to fight it and crawl out by calling out to God, and He will save us from there.